First of all, I want to welcome everyone to the David N. Kershaw Award Lecture. I'm Paul Decker. I'm President and CEO of Mathematica Policy Research. And David Kershaw founded Mathematica and became its first president in 1968. David also had a strong connection to APPAM, participating in the establishment of the association as well as guiding Mathematica to be one of the initial founding institutional members of APPAM. Unfortunately, David died in 1979 at the age of 37, well before he was able to see APPAM or Mathematica flourish in subsequent years. Long before the term thought leader became popular, David Kershaw was a thought leader in the area of public policy. He was a creative and innovative researcher who directed path-breaking studies in employment, health, housing, and education policy. He wrote extensively on research methods, and he often testified before Congress on research issues. David was committed to finding better ways to answer important social and economic policy questions, applying scientific rigor to policy in innovative ways. I'm proud to be involved in commemorating David through the administration of the Kershaw Award. Although I didn't know David personally, as a 26-year employee of Mathematica, as well as its president, I can't help but feel his influence, as well as the obligation to uphold the standards that he and his colleagues set in the early years of the organization. The Kershaw Award was established to honor persons who, under the age of 40, have made a distinguished contribution to the field of public policy analysis and management. The award consists of a commemorative medal as well as a cash prize of $10,000. And this is the 17th award since the establishment. The recipient is selected by a three-person committee consisting of the president of Mathematica, the president of APPAM, and the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. And I'd like to thank both Angela Evans and Cecilia Rouse for serving on the committee over this past year. The recipient of this year's Kershaw Award is Donald Moynihan. Don is currently professor of public affairs at the La Follette School at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he also served as the associate director of the school from 2009 to 2012. Don received his PhD from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University in 2002. He then spent time at Michigan State University and Texas A&M before moving to the University of Wisconsin in 2005. Don's research resides solidly at the intersection of public policy and management, appropriate for APPAM. A consistent thread throughout Don's work is his focus on how public management processes work and how they relate to policy outcomes both in broad areas but also more specifically in areas such as homeland security, in elections, and in Medicaid. Don brings a mixture of the traditional and the innovative to his public management research. His research employs a variety of methods, including both quantitative and qualitative methods, and even extending to the use of laboratory and field experiments to examine the use of performance data on decision-making. He takes a broad approach and prioritizes finding the right technique and the right data to answer the pressing public policy and management questions at hand. While Don's work cuts across a variety of topics, he's considered one of the foremost scholars and commentators on performance management reform efforts in government. Rather than simply describe such reform efforts, Don seeks to apply social science techniques as well as theories of organizational behavior to understanding if and why such reforms work. His 2008 book, The Dynamics of Performance Management, won the Best Book Award from the public section of the Academy of Management, as well as the Herbert Simon Book Award from the American Political Science Association. The book advanced a theory of interactive dialogue that proposed that performance data are ambiguous and subjective, and Don documents how stakeholders use performance data selectively in ways that support different and often competing political objectives. More broadly, Don's collective research in the area of performance management achieves a number of important goals. It legitimizes the use of performance as an important and useful variable in studying public management. It develops valid measures of performance, and it effectively deploys a series of research techniques to tackle critical questions related to performance management. Don's research has been commended with more than a dozen significant awards and has received wide-ranging recognition. In addition to the awards I already mentioned, in 2014, 2 of his articles were selected among the 75 most influential articles ever published in Public Administration Review. Don also was a recent 3-time winner of the Joseph Holley Scholarship Award from the American Society for Public Administration for outstanding scholarship on performance in public and nonprofit organizations. In 2011, Don was the youngest fellow elected to the National Academy of Public Administration, and in 2012, he received the Distinguished Research Award from the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration and the American Society for Public Administration. Finally, while Don's career has been a remarkably productive one, he also has been an outstanding colleague. One contributor referred to Don as one of the most generous and dedicated colleagues there is, to his school, but also more broadly to his profession and to the many organizations to which he has contributed. This dedication, combined with the energy and the insight that he brings to public management issues, makes Don's contributions to public management research special. Like David Kershaw, Don has demonstrated that he cares deeply about finding the right answers to policy-related questions. And he's therefore a particularly appropriate recipient of the award that honors David's memory. It's my pleasure and honor to present the 2014 David N. Kershaw Award to Donald Moynihan.
Much for that very generous introduction. I sort of feel like I should quit while I'm ahead and stop the lecture. Now, I'm going to adjust the mic from Decker level to Moynihan level here. It's really a great honor to receive this award. I'm especially honored to receive any award that advertises the winner's relative youth. So anyone who's asked me about the award in previous weeks, I've told them the primary criteria is that you're not 40. And some of my colleagues have called it the I Can't Believe You're Not 40 award. And I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight, but really the primary takeaway should be I'm not 4 years old yet. I have a lot of thanks to give, so I'm going to try and keep that short. I'd like to thank the institutions that I found myself in my life. I moved to the United States from Ireland when I was 21, and I started a master's and then a PhD at the Maxwell School at Syracuse. And I'm very much a product of the Maxwell School, but I'm also a product of the institution where I'm at now, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I feel like I've gotten, in effect, a second PhD. I feel fortunate to be at an institution where our chancellor, Becky Blank, is a former winner of this award, so understands something about what this means. I'd like to say thanks to the nominating committee, Caroline Heinrich, just a wonderful friend and colleague, as well as an extraordinary scholar. David Weimer, past president of APPAM, past editor of JPAM, and I think an exemplar of someone who can develop really good conceptual tools and apply them with enormous practical relevance. Tim Smeating, one of our most distinguished scholars of poverty and social policy, and Patricia Ingram, who was my mentor at the Maxwell School, and it was really a model for just a wonderful mentor to have as a PhD student. Thanks also to the awards committee, to Paul, Angela Evans, president of APPAM, and Cecilia Roos, the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. thanks to Mathematica for sponsoring the Kershaw Award, although I should note my disappointment that there's no giant novelty check I can bring back with me on the plane. And thanks also to my co-authors. It's a long list of people. It includes people like Pam Hurd, Tom DeLear, Sanjay Pandey, Brad Wright, Stefan Levartu, all of whom have contributed to the body of work that's being honored with this award, but who get to share none of the cash. Okay, so the central theme of my talk tonight is about the possibility of fruitful research at the intersection of policy and administration. And I'm very much involved being at APPAM because I think this is one of the few places where people who do both policy and administration get to talk to one another. My instructions in the award letter were to talk about my research that generated this award. So in what follows, you're going to hear a lot of self-references, and so just assume that all that self-indulgence is involuntary and deeply embarrassing to me. I started out as a classical public administration scholar, and then over time I've spent more and more time working at the intersection between policy and administration. And if you work in this field, and if you work at APPAM, you know there are sometimes tensions between different groups within the association, and perhaps those of us who are public management scholars feel that tension a little bit more than others. So I hope this award is seen as a strong signal about our place in the association. To the degree that policy and administration have been separated intellectually, I think that's sometimes been problematic for the field of public affairs as a whole. I think it generates certain types of intellectual blind spots. For the field of what we might call policy studies, some of those blind spots has been a tendency to perhaps not pay attention to administration generally, to make very general assumptions about administrative motivation and behavior that might not be terribly recognizable to people who actually study administrators, to sometimes treat administration as a troubling deviance. For example, when we look at the role of administrative factors in evaluation-inspired studies. And those are certain blind spots, but I think public administration has also been guilty of certain blind spots. So I think we have a tendency perhaps not to think closely about the policy area in which we're situating our studies, to perhaps treat it as an unvarying background, and to perhaps also go a little further, to perhaps treat it as an object that administrative actors reconstitute by their actions. To frame what follows, I'm going to draw on theory from political science and a recent paper I wrote with Joe Sauce, a former colleague from Wisconsin, now at Minnesota. And this theory is policy feedback theory. The basic argument of policy feedback theory is that the claim that politics shapes policies, the traditional way we understand the policy-making process, is not incorrect, but also that policies serve as a political force that alter politics around them. And by politics here, I mean the term broadly to include things like citizen interactions with the state, access to resources, as well as choices about particular policy changes. And I'm going to talk about the interaction between policy and administration in three ways. The first is the idea that policy effects on politics include an administrative aspect. The second is the idea that administration affects policy. And the third is that policy affects administration. And so obviously those are, if you like, causal arrows, they're going in opposite directions there. But the point is there is a dialogical relationship between policy and administration. To understand both of those factors, we have to explore that dialogical relationship. The first relationship I'm going to talk about is the relationship between policy and politics and the role of administration in that relationship. So the basic claim here is that administration works as part of policies and their effects on political outcomes. And I can give some very obvious potential examples here. One is the ways in which policies about elections and the administration of elections matter to basic political democratic participation. So for example, in a paper that was published earlier this year in the American Journal of Political Science with some colleagues from our Department of Political Science, we looked at how election laws across the United States affected turnout. And while most of the current policy attention tends to be on voter ID laws, what we focused a lot of attention on was the way in which allowing people to register on the same day that they vote increased turnout. So access to this fairly simple administrative process had significant effects on whether turnout was going to be higher and lower. So election laws might be one thing, but we were also interested in the discretion of election officials. So a second study looked at the role of election officials in the state of Wisconsin. These are officially nonpartisan appointed positions, and the ways in which their ideological beliefs might matter to turnout. What we found, that was I think the compelling story here, was that when election officials had ideological beliefs that varied from the majority of their constituents, turnout tended to be lower. So the use of bureaucratic discretion was in some fashion limiting access to registration by voters or making the active voters more limited. Those are obvious examples. There are perhaps less obvious examples of the role of administration in the effects between policy and politics. The political scientist Suzanne Mettler has made the argument that the ways in which policies matter to individual civic capacities is partly by providing resources to people, some sort of benefits or good, and partly also by providing interactions with the state. And these bureaucratic encounters where people try to get access to goods and experience the state have an effect on both these resources and experiences. In recent work that I've been working on with people like Tom DeLear, Pam Hurd, and Elizabeth Rigby, we've tried to understand that interaction using the concept of what we call administrative burdens. And I'd argue that as I describe it, aspects of this concept might appear familiar to you from some different literatures, but there's been a failure to cohere into an overarching concept or research agenda that's partly indicative of some of those divisions between the field of policy and administration. We've come to conceptualize burdens as a series of costs. The first type of cost is if you're trying to get access to a resource or good, you have to engage in some learning process. You have to find out if you're eligible. You have to find out what you might be able to get, where you can get it, what you have to do to apply. That's not innate knowledge that any of us are born with, so it requires some sort of time and effort investment on the part of the individual. The second type of cost we identify are psychological costs. So some programs have high level of stigma attached to them, and that might transfer to people's experience of the program. Some interactions with bureaucratic actors might be exercises in power, might be to some degree generating a sense of loss of autonomy on the part of the citizen. And in some cases, the actual potential for losing a benefit might generate some sort of stresses. Again, these are another type of cost. The third category of costs we've started to talk about is compliance costs, and this is more classic bureaucratic red tape, so complying with basic administrative rules and procedures, stay on the program, so completing forms, documenting your status, the frequency of your certification, the money you might spend on perhaps hiring legal help to get access to services. Once we conceptualize this idea of administrative burden, we try to make an argument for why it matters. And we think it matters in a couple of very obvious ways. One is, as burdens increase, access or take-up to programs and resources might decline. For example, we know that universal programs have almost 100% take-up, programs like Social Security, whereas more means-tested programs tend to have take-up at much lower rates, partly because they have to create rules and processes to sort out the eligible from the ineligible, and in doing so also create burdens that citizens have to negotiate. In our work in Wisconsin, looking at public health insurance, we offer evidence that efforts to reduce burden actually increase take-up among the eligible population. And we also make the observation that the capacity to overcome burdens might have an inequality effect, that individuals with higher levels of human capital or resources have greater capacity to overcome burdens, and therefore burdens might reinforce inequality between groups. A second type of question we're very much interested in the administrative burden agenda is the way in which administrative burdens interact with politics. And so we propose the question of whether burdens are policy making by other means. And we argue this in part because burdens often have a certain set of qualities that might make them attractive as policy tools. They are opaque. Their effects might not be easily stood. So for example, the number of questions you have on forms, or the frequency with which you require people to recertify their status might seem like technical administrative matters that avoid the usual give and take of the policymaking process and become delegated from the legislative branch to the executive branch. They can be presented as technical fixes to serve widely accepted values, such as preventing fraud. And so all of these factors might make them attractive tools to policymakers. Our hypothesis here is that the preferences that political actors have about programs and policies generally will transfer into the types of decisions that they make about administrative burdens. And if burdens and the creation of burdens is indeed opaque in many policy areas, that's going to be difficult to track. So we've tried to address this in a couple of ways. One is using a cross-time historical case study of public health insurance in the state of Wisconsin. And the second is doing a simple cross-sectional model where we coded the complexity of Medicaid forms and found that the primary explanatory variable seemed to be unified partisan control of different state governments. There's also a practical aspect to this agenda, which is when should burdens actually be reduced? And in some cases, administrative burdens serve valid political needs. But in some cases, even as they serve those needs, the effects might be so great that we would be concerned about them. Some of our work has looked at ways in which burdens can be reduced, partly by documenting the experience of Wisconsin. So outreach might reduce learning costs on the part of population. Form simplification might reduce compliance costs. Presenting public health insurance as something for the working poor rather than as a form of welfare might reduce some stigma costs. There's also potential for reducing burdens in a way that don't engage in certain value trade-offs. So for example, if burdens can be shifted onto the state and the use of information technology and administrative data can make it easier for the state to determine eligibility with a greater sense of certainty than relying on self-reported information. A final practical aspect of this agenda is the role of the state in monitoring burdens. One of the things we've seen change since David Kershaw was involved in APPAM is the growth of what we sometimes call the hollow state, the reliance on third-party providers to deliver services. And in this time period, the government has sometimes struggled to articulate what its role is in monitoring the hollow state. We contract, for example, for money, how much money service providers spend, the level of service that they provide, so some measure of outputs perhaps, but we could also contract for the level of administrative burdens that citizens experience in their encounters with third-party providers. The second relationship I want to talk about is the way in which administration affects policy. And here, I'm not offering a novel claim. We already know from the study of implementation theory, street-level bureaucracy, or principal agent models of government that there's a high capacity for individual bureaucrats to affect policy. My contributions rather have been in the study of administrative instruments that are designed to reduce information asymmetry and foster goal alignment. That is to say, the use of performance measures. And these performance requirements come in a couple of different formats. Sometimes they come in government-wide reforms like the Government Performance and Results Act, the Program Assessment Rating Tool under President Bush, the GIPRA Modernization Act that was passed in 2010. And sometimes these requirements come in specific policy directives, such as the No Child Left Behind Act, Race to the Top, or welfare reform. In contemporary governance, assumptions about the effects of performance systems carry a lot of weight. And I think it's helpful here to quote something that I wrote in my book, The Dynamics of Performance Management. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that we are betting the future of governance on the use of performance information. The current era is characterized by a willingness to adopt new structural forms of government and controls, such as networks and outsourcing, or to simply provide greater freedom to managers. These generate difficult questions. How do we coordinate? How do we manage? How do we control? How do we exert accountability? How do we improve? How do we engage citizens? Performance information is frequently cited as the answer. It will allow citizens to provide feedback on services. It will provide the basis for accountability. It will be tied to incentives. It will allow innovations to be identified. If performance information is not up to this task, if it is not the future linchpin of governance, then we have to return to the basic questions I identified above. If there's a single lesson from my body of work in this area, is that the implementation of performance systems are themselves difficult, complex, and suffer implementation difficulties that we normally associate with policy implementation. A couple of examples. The arguments for the adoption of performance systems frequently drew from a set of management theories called the New Public Management, arguing that performance could be improved by essentially giving managers greater freedom and also imposing upon them higher expectations for results. My dissertation studied the implementation of these performance systems across state governments, and while I found that there was evidence of higher performance expectations in governments, at least in terms of the adoption of these systems, there was very little change in terms of the autonomy that managers had in terms of things like personnel controls and financial controls. So instead of moving to this box where there was a performance management ideal type, instead public managers found themselves in a situation where they had a higher emphasis on performance but little additional authority to actually achieve goals. A second implementation difficulty that we experience with performance systems arises from our basic assumptions about what performance data is and what it can do for us. So the performance movement has generally presented performance data as something that can fully capture the effects of programs, that's objective, that indicates actual performance, that is consistently understood by policymakers, and helps to generate a consensus and better decisions. I argued in my book that this was mistaken for a couple of reasons. One is that performance data has some basic qualities of ambiguity. For any particular program, it's going to be impossible if the program is somewhat complex to list all of the ways in which performance should be reflected. And so two people could look at the same program and come up with a different list of valid performance measures. The ambiguity also extends to their interpretation of those measures. For example, two people could look at a school and look at the same performance data and come to different conclusions about the meaning of that data. One person might say, test scores are up from last year, the school is doing well. Another person might say, but they still lag behind their peers, the school is not doing well. Even if they agreed on the meaning of the data, individuals might still disagree on what the next steps or actions should be as a result of interpreting that data. They might decide, for example, to put more resources into a school, or they might decide to close it down or put in place new management. That basic quality of ambiguity leads to subjectivity in the policy system. When performance data is used by actors who have certain biases, ideological worldviews, partisan approaches to understanding the world, or represent different institutions, what happens is that performance data is selected, presented, and interpreted in ways that fit with individuals' worldviews. So performance data doesn't really replace politics. At best, it becomes part of the political dialogue between stakeholders. In trying to think about how these performance systems actually matter in practice, I've argued for studying the use of performance data by public managers. And there's been a growing literature in this area. I think I've contributed in a couple of particular ways. One is to think about the relationship between politics and the use of performance data. So earlier I made the case that politics might generate an interactive dialogue between policy actors. Some evidence for that comes from a study of Texas school superintendents, where we found that superintendents that had more demographically diverse, engaged, and contentious stakeholders also reported that they were more likely to use performance data, partly because performance data gave them a mechanism to justify their performance across these different stakeholders. In some cases, however, politics might affect the ways in which performance systems are implemented. So I spent a good deal of time studying the program assessment rating tool under the Bush administration. And one thing we learned there is that the implementation of this tool differed between what political scientists categorize as liberal and more conservative agencies. Effectively, individuals who worked in conservative agencies and who were exposed to PART were more likely to use performance data relative to peers in their agencies who weren't exposed to PART, or to peers in liberal agencies. Liberal agencies, on the other hand, experienced PART as being more burdensome and using both survey items and controlling for individual ideological biases, as well as objective measures of workloads such as performance improvement plans that resulted from PART. We could show that this divergence between conservative and liberal agencies appeared to be quite real. So in some sense, when there's a difference, an ideological divergence between the political executive and the agencies that are receiving these performance reforms, it can have this differential effect between agencies. We characterize this as, in some cases, preaching to the choir or burdening the heretics who disagree with you. A second contribution in the design and implementation of performance systems is to think about their role in organizations and the routines that they create. So in the last couple of years, I've worked with a variety of authors to try and get at this question. And with Stefan Leverty, the former PhD student from Wisconsin, we studied the effects of PART and GIPRA using data from the Government Accountability Office. And what we found is that on aggregate, the routines created by PART and GIPRA were not associated with higher use of performance data controlling for other factors. At a paper I presented in a panel just before I came here with Alex Kroll, we provide evidence that the GIPRA Modernization Act, which created different sets of routines, for example, it required people to meet quarterly to talk about performance data, seems to be succeeding in a way that GIPRA and PART were not, offering some evidence, I think, about in terms of thinking about ways in which organizational routines can be designed to facilitate the use of performance information. Government-wide studies using surveys are messy, but necessary, I think, to get better causal control and understanding of what drives the use of performance data. Experimental designs are very helpful. So I'm going to talk about a couple of experiments that I've been involved in. One is used survey experiments where we created a budget game scenario where students were given different types of performance information and asked to make resource decisions. And here the interactive dialogue model argues that the ways in which performance data is presented might affect the ways in which people understand it. So in these experiments, both the treatment and control groups get the same performance data, and then the treatment group gets some additional information. So for example, in one experiment, we gave the treatment group a list of targets alongside the performance data that was actually reported. And even though the performance data looked better each year and seemed to be showing an impressive track record, it still didn't match up to what were arguably unrealistic targets. The effect of providing those unrealistically high target information was to change the way in which individuals understood the actual performance data to the point that they became less generous in funding that particular program. we found similar effects in adding advocacy comments, which directed respondents how to understand and interpret the performance data. More recently, I've been working with field experiments in the context of Denmark, looking at how provisions of different types of treatments to school principals affect the ways in which to use performance data. So providing greater personnel autonomy to school principals seems to be correlated with the use of performance data, and here we're using whether we can track whether school principals, unbeknownst to them, are downloading performance data from a certain website, so we have some objective measure of whether they're seeking out performance data. And so we provide evidence that autonomy on personnel decisions does seem to be associated with the use of performance data. We also provide some evidence that when people are given more comparative data, which tends to be more useful, so if you're shown where your school ranks compared to other schools, you tend to be more likely to then search out additional performance data. Finally, we find, and I think again this is consistent with the interactive dialogue model, that people's individual preferences and worldviews about what the appropriate goals are for education affect the type of performance data they tend to download. The third and final part of my talk gets to the reverse of what I've just been talking about, which is the way in which policy affects administration. And this is perhaps the difficult part for me to talk about because I come from an administrative background. The argument I would make to you is that policies alter administrative authorities, routines, tasks, and resources, and those changes in turn reshape culture, identity, and motivation of administrative actors. But you don't see a lot of studies of those sorts of processes in the literature of public administration, partly because they're difficult to observe. They become easier in policy areas where we see dramatic policy change in a certain time period, and then we can observe differences. So I'm going to talk about two such examples. The first is the Help America Vote Act. So this is going back to the era of the election administration. And understanding the passage of this act in the aftermath of the 2000 presidential campaign helps to solve a particular policy adoption and implementation puzzle, which is why a certain type of technology, which was more expensive and appeared to be less highly performing, was widely adopted by election officials, and these are electronic voting machines. And the obvious answer is that HAVA created incentives and directives that made the adoption of those technologies more likely. And once that adoption took place, path dependency effects took hold. So we completed with Carol Silva the first survey of election officials. That was a national survey in the United States. And with Stefan Levertu again, we found evidence of cognitive biases on the part of election officials who tended to defend or were resistant to changing electronic voting machines. In particular, there was a general faith in technology that these people expressed, even above and beyond the perceived cost and benefits of the particular technology that they had adopted. More generally, we observed that HAVA increased the workloads of election officials, created lots of new tasks, and if you were to believe that from a variety of focus groups, qualitative studies, surveys, made the job of being an election official much less attractive to them. Still within the field of election administration, but now focusing on the state of Wisconsin, we also found evidence that the adoption of certain election policies altered bureaucratic beliefs and their own preferences about policies. So in Wisconsin, policies that were adopted to make access to voting more convenient, such as early voting, allowing people to register on election day, as those policies became perceived as burdensome by election officials also became more likely to become critical of the policies on unrelated angles. So for example, they were more likely to believe that allowing people to vote on the same day that allowing people to register on the same day that they vote was not achieving the goal of increasing turnout, when that's sort of an erroneous assumption to make. They were also more likely to oppose additional policy changes that that would have further provided convenience to voters. So it became more opposed in their worldview about providing access to citizens to voting. The second policy area I'm going to talk about is in the area of crisis response. Using funding from the National Science Foundation, I studied the adoption and implementation of incident command systems, which was a policy that directed actors about how to interact with each other in the event of a disaster. So with any large disaster, you have networks of responders who come together, lots of different organizations with varying level of familiarity with one another, and they have to find mechanisms of social coordination in a very limited time period. That's an interesting public policy and social problem. The incident command system was adopted as a way to try and solve this problem by essentially overlaying a hierarchical layer of authority on this network of responders. Some of my research observed this changes in understandings of authority, language, and norms of responders as a result of the adoption of the incident command system. But also the way in which it worked still reflected the network characteristics of crisis response. So classic network characteristics, such as whether network actors were familiar with one another, tended to affect whether these ICS systems were effective or not in managing incident responses. I can give a couple of more detailed examples of the way in which crisis policy mattered to the way in which organizations address their tasks. And the best example comes with the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense is directed in successive national response frameworks to take part and prepare for a role in any large disaster response. This runs contrary to a traditional cultural belief of the Department of Defense, which is that they don't do operations that are not military or war in their focus, and that they don't coordinate with civilian agencies. And so this policy was pushing them in an area that they didn't want to go. Using qualitative studies of the response of the Department of Defense in Hurricane Katrina, I point to evidence that leaders in this organization were successful in, at least for a limited time period, shifting the cultural beliefs of its members by calling on a different cultural assumption that they had. So if one cultural belief of the Department of Defense is that we like to be autonomous, we don't like to work with civilian agencies, another cultural belief is that we have a can-do culture, that if you set us a task, we will achieve that. And you can see, closely studying how the Department of Defense responded during Hurricane Katrina, ways in which leaders altered the language and messages that they provided to members on the ground, going from things like saying, we're not going to work with FEMA, to saying you have a blank check to do whatever it is that you need to do to solve this problem, the way in which that cultural assumption was evoked and engendered a more active response in this disaster. A second aspect of the role of the Department of Defense in Katrina gives us a sense of how these networks are supposed to work in practice. One very basic observation I made about the differences between private sector networks and public sector networks is that private sector networks, the logic for why actors coordinate with each other is based largely on some comparative gains of trade. You work with someone because you get some benefit from them. In public sector networks, that's often not true. You might be part of a network because you're required by law to be there. So there's a mandated element of the network. This is true of the Department of Defense in national response crisis. So DoD is required to take directions from FEMA, even though DoD doesn't have much to gain from FEMA. That mandated quality of the network then affects how the network plays out in practice. So one of the basic claims of research on networks is that networks become more successful if actors develop norms of reciprocity, if they coordinate with each other because they trust one another. So you build a good reputation with other network members. The fact that you're in the mandated network might mean that your reputation among non-network actors is more important to you than your reputation within the network. So put in a more sort of obvious way, the DoD cares more about what the president and the general public thinks about it than and it cares about what FEMA thinks about the DoD. As a result of that, the way in which you behave tends to be different than it would be in voluntary networks. So in the case of Katrina, you see the Department of Defense, while providing a very vigorous response, also doing things like engaging in solo action, shifting a lot of political blame onto FEMA that makes the likelihood of the network succeeding and working together in the next disaster somewhat less likely to occur. The final example I'll point to is back to performance systems. And again, I'm sort of making a case here that these are also sort of policy changes, whether they come in the form of something like the No Child Left Behind Act or welfare reform. And there's a couple of observations I want to make here. So one of the most cited paper I have is a paper with Sanjay Pandey, where we looked at the role of public service motivation in organizations. We built on Jim Perry's work here, and we made the observation that we sometimes assume that people's motivation is exogenous to the organization, but in fact, people's desire to help others might be shaped by the organizational environment that you find yourself in. We offered some evidence of that, pointing to, for example, the experience of red tape being demotivating, or the length of time that people spent in public organizations as reducing public service motivation. It's a short step from that observation to a second observation, which is that as policies change the organizational environment, they start to change also the motivations and beliefs of the people who work in organizations. So work with Brad Wright and Sanjay Pandey again has pointed out that in context where there aren't strong extrinsic incentives, one of the predictors of the use of performance data tends to be whether you score highly on intrinsic or altruistic measures of motivation. However, once you start adding strong extrinsic factors, I'm drawing here from the literature on crowding out, there's a much higher potential that the use of performance information becomes perhaps driven by perverse motivations. So for example, earlier today, Carolyn Heinrich and I were sitting on a panel where we were talking about what happened with the Veterans Affairs Administration and the ways in which perverse use of data occurred in the context of a pay-for-performance system. Collectively, my work suggests that perhaps we should think about performance systems by emphasizing routines of learning, professional values, and appealing to altruistic values rather than designing them on the basis of extrinsic reward and strong external accountability demands. So let me conclude here, and I'll ask for questions in a second or comments. But I'd like to come back to the central theme, the idea that it's possible to have a fruitful career working at the intersection of policy and administration. And I might go further and say this is perhaps the most interesting part of the field of public affairs, the place in which policy and administration interacts with one another. Examining the interplay of those two things, I think, allows us a greater purchase on causal relationships and gives us a greater persuasiveness when we're willing to make policy advice. Metaphors that I've been using to describe this area, the space between, borders, intersections, might evoke images of geographical uncertainty, perhaps some discomfort. It might sound like a place you could easily become lost, and it might require you to ask, what are the qualities that allow you to be successful working at these odd spaces? And I think those qualities include a willingness to explore, comfort with ambiguity, patience with unfamiliarity, an appetite for new ways of thinking, an ability to meld up those new ways of thinking with the old, and perhaps a capacity to link with those that you might appear to have little in common with. These same qualities are also a plausible list of what it takes to be an immigrant moving into a new country, and that might be partly a hypothesis about why I'm doing the type of work I'm doing today. APPAM was one of the first places I presented when I was a PhD student. I think it is one of the few, and certainly the best place, where people who are interested in working in these policy spaces actually talk to one another and it's the place where there's the largest number of fellow travelers who explore those spaces. So I'm privileged to be part of this community. Thank you.